Alright, so everything you saw in that opening sequence was all shot on the same setting on the Sony a7S III, and that's the S&Q mode, otherwise known as the slow and quick. And today I'm going to show you how I filmed all that, how I set up all my settings for the shots, and how we can do slow motion and time lapses using this one setting. So the S&Q mode is on a lot of different Sony cameras, and I'll show you guys how to set up that as well. And if you guys are new to this channel, my name is Kyle Watts. I do a lot of gear reviews and film tutorials, so think about subscribing down below if you want to follow along. Alright, before we get started, I just want to mention the settings I'm talking about in this video are for the NTSC settings in North and South America. So I'm referring to 24 frames a second, 60 frames a second, and 120 frames a second. If you live outside of North America, you are in PAL settings, PAL, which is like 25 frames, 50 frames a second, and 100 frames a second. So if you're not seeing the same numbers I'm talking about, just go to the closest number you have in your camera, and that'll be the same settings that you're going to shoot for. So what the S&Q mode actually is a quick function to get to slow motion shots and time lapses, otherwise known as slow and quick. So some of the cameras that have this mode are like the a7 III, the a7S III, the a7R III and 4, the a6100, the a6400, the a6600, probably a few other ones that I'm not naming here, but the mode is on the dial here. You'll see it with an S&Q right on there. And what you do is you just flip it to that mode, and whatever you had it preset to, that's what it's going to shoot in. So if you have this thing set to 60 frames a second or 120 frames a second, that's what it's going to shoot in. You can also go the other way with it and go to like 1 or 2 frames per second and shoot long time lapses. So what are some of the advantages of recording in the S&Q mode? First off, it eliminates the post-production need to slow down your footage or speed up your footage. If you film it in 60 frames per second, it will automatically slow down the footage to the correct speed in camera. And same goes in the quick mode. If you speed it up to 1 frame a second, it'll automatically speed it up to 24 times speed in camera. Secondly, it eliminates the need to do interval shooting. Interval shooting, for those who don't know, is just when you take one picture every X amount of seconds, and then you stitch them all together in either one of the Sony programs or in your editing station and make it into a video. So it's like putting a bunch of pictures into your timeline and making them in a video. It takes a little bit more work to do that, and it's definitely more time consuming. So when you put it in quick mode, it records that way and you have to do nothing. Thirdly, it takes away all the guesswork on how slow you need to actually slow down your footage in post, because it's just all done in camera. One other thing that I actually do use this camera for sometimes is I'll put it in S&Q mode just to test the room and see if I have like flickering lights or if I have to change a shutter speed or something like that, which is a good thing to do if you're filming in other modes that isn't S&Q. It's kind of nice to test it just to see what it's going to look like in camera. That way you can take out the guesswork and the frustration of getting home, putting your footage in your editing station, and then finding out all the lights were flickering and it looks terrible. Alright, so let's dive into the menu system and let's find out how to get this thing set up. First up, we're going to use the new menu system on the Sony a7S III. So any of the Sony cameras that are coming out now or in the future that have the new Sony menu, follow this one. Okay, so the first thing you want to do with the a7S III is make sure that you're in movie mode on your dial. And then when you open your menu here, you're going to scroll down to shooting menu, which is the first menu, has a picture of a camera. You'll scroll over to image quality and then scroll over to file format. Now, file format's going to be what project settings you're shooting in. I shoot in 4K, so I'm going to put it to XAVC 4K. If you go into HD, you can actually film in 240 frames a second. Just heads up on that, by the way. But we're going to go in this mode at first, which is the 4K mode. So then I'm going to scroll down to my S&Q settings from there. All right, so in the S&Q settings, my record frame rate is the project frame rate that I'm in. I shoot in 24p, so I'm going to put that in 24p. And then you can scroll down to your frame rate. So this is going to be deciding on if you're going to want to shoot in 120 frames a second, 60 frames a second, 30 frames a second for slow motion. And then you have the option of 15, 8, 4, 2, and 1 for your time lapse and your quick mode. 1 being 24x speed and 120 being 5 times slower. Now on the a7S III, you do have to make sure you have the correct SD card to shoot certain modes. So if you're trying to shoot 120 frames per second, you're going to need a minimum of a V90 card, and that's going to be to shoot in 4K S mode. If you want to shoot in the SI mode, you're going to need to use a CF Express card. Now, if you want to shoot in 60 frames a second or any of these other modes, you'll need at least a V60 card. I'm shooting in 60 frames a second on my camera because I don't have a V90 card, and also I just kind of like the 60 frames per second look over 120 in most situations. So for slow motion, I'll set this up for 60. And then the last setting is your record setting. And this is your data. I'm going to be shooting in 10-bit. So if you're not shooting in 10-bit, you can change this to like a 420 8-bit. This will be a little easier on your computer without having to make proxies as well. But I'm going to keep mine in 422 10-bit because I like having the highest quality that I can get out of this camera. Now if you're shooting in quick mode time lapses, I would probably start with like 1 or 2 frames per second depending on what you're shooting. The 24x speed kind of just looks cool. You can go up to like 8 or 15 if you want to have something that's just slightly sped up. So one thing that you are going to want to know too is that you want to make sure that when you jump into your S&Q mode, you're going to definitely want to look to make sure that your shutter speed is correct, because when you switch from your movie mode to your S&Q mode, that's the one thing that doesn't follow with the camera. It will stay in the shutter speed that you were previously in movie mode. So if you're switching to go to 60 frames a second, make sure it's in 1/25th of a second. Now as Sony moves forward, no doubt this new menu system will be in probably most of their new cameras. So hopefully this video stays the same and will help you set up your future Sony cameras as they come out. So one thing that I like to do in my camera setups, and this can be both in the new menu and in the old menu system, is you can go to a thing called My Menu, which is like your favorites. You can actually go in and select the S&Q settings out of the My Menu settings and save it over to here to a quick setting. So that way you can switch your frame rates on the fly really quickly. The other option that you can do as well is put it into your function menu. So if you bring up your function menu, you can have it down here at the bottom, and you can change between your frame rates in your S&Q settings there as well. That's probably the fastest of the two, and I would definitely recommend setting that up in your S&Q settings in your function menu. All right, so now let's dive into some of the other Sony cameras that use the older Sony menu. And this is going to be for cameras like the a7 III, the a6400, the a7siii, pretty much any of the other ones that have the older system. Let's check that out. Okay, so here on the a6400, we're going to go into our menu and we're going to scroll to the top and switch over to tab 2, which is the video mode. And then from there, we can actually skip file format because the S&Q mode on these cameras only record in 1080p anyways. So we're going to scroll down to our S&Q settings. So the first setting is your record setting. This is going to be in 24p if you shoot in a 24p timeline. It'll be in 30 if you shoot in 30. So from there, you're going to switch down to frame rate, and this is going to be what frame rate you want to record in. So if you want to record in slow motion, you pick either 120, 60, or 30, and that'll be the speed that you're in, or you're going to go to 15, 8, 4, 2, or 1 for your quick motion time lapses. 1 being 24 times speed and 120 frames per second being 5 times slower. So then once you've made that selection, now you just need to switch to your S&Q dial. And if you're in slow motion, just make sure in twice the shutter speed of your frame rate, and you're all set to go. So another thing that you have to explain is that when you jump into these S&Q modes, you have to make sure that you're matching your shutter speed to the frame rate you're shooting in. So if you're shooting in 60 frames per second, you're going to want to go over 1/125th. And if you're shooting in like 120 frames a second, you're going to want to go over to 1/250th of a second. And that's going to give you the correct shutter speed to get the correct motion blur. Now setting up in quick mode, I actually start at 1/50th of a shutter speed, which is my standard 24 frames per second shutter speed. I'll start there and I'll actually go lower depending on how much more motion blur I want. So if you're doing like car traffic or like people walking, sometimes it's kind of cool to go down to like 1/20th or 1/10th of a second shutter speed. It gives you this kind of really cool motion blur passing in time versus something that just looks sped up. If you start at 1/50th of a shutter speed, you'll get what looks like fast-forwarded footage. It still has motion blur, but it's definitely more distinct. Versus lower shutter speed, it gets really a lot of motion blur in it. It looks kind of cool. So one huge tip that I'll recommend is that when you're shooting time-lapse mode, make sure that you have it on like a tripod or on like a table or something where it's not moving, unless you're using like a motorized slider. That's a whole different look, which is cool. But don't walk around in time-lapse mode unless you're on a gimbal maybe. But any movement that you have in the camera kind of ruins the effect of a time-lapse unless it's very smooth. All right, so that's all I have for you today on the S&Q mode on these Sony cameras. If you have any questions, go ahead and leave me a comment down below. Like the video if this has been a help for you at all. And subscribe to the channel if you want to follow along to any other gear reviews and film tutorials. And as always, guys, we'll catch you on the next one. Later.